When I shared that I was pregnant, Mom laughed. Your sister just closed on her new house. That's the only good news today. Dad smirked. Great, now we have two burdens. I just stood up and walked away. My next move changes their lives forever. I didn't say anything back. I just grabbed my coat off the chair, said a quiet goodnight to no one in particular, and walked out the front door into the cold. My husband was already in the driveway with the engine running, like some part of him had known before I did that we weren't staying for dessert. He took one look at my face in the porch light and didn't ask a single question. He just reached over, unlocked my door, and drove. We didn't talk for the first 10 minutes. The heater ticked. Street lights slid across the windshield in long yellow smears. Finally, he said, not looking away from the road. You okay? I don't know yet, I said. And that was the truest thing I could offer him. What my parents didn't know, what they had never once bothered to ask about in 6 years, was that I was the reason their comfortable life still existed at all. Not in some abstract, sentimental way, literally, financially, down to the dollar. Every spring for 6 years, I paid my parents' property taxes, quietly, out of my own savings, so they wouldn't lose the house they'd owned since before I was born. When their utility bills piled up 2 winters ago after my father's hours got cut at plant, I set up automatic transfers from my account to cover the difference so the power didn't get shut off in January. And when my sister needed a co-signer for the loan that financed her first investment property, because her credit wasn't strong enough on its own despite the corporate salary and the tailored blazers, I signed. My name, my credit history, my liquidity backing every dollar of it. None of that made me anything other than the quiet one at family dinners. My sister got the toasts, I got the tab, and I paid it without complaint because complaining had never once gotten me anywhere in that house. It had been that way as long as I could remember. Growing up, my sister's report cards went on the refrigerator door under a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Mine got a nod, if that, folded into the stack of mail on the counter. When Vanessa got her first job out of college, my parents threw a dinner at the steakhouse downtown, the good one with the leather booths. When I got promoted to senior auditor 2 years ago, a promotion that came with a real raise and a real office, my mother's first question was whether that meant I'd finally get a real job with people. As if numbers on a screen weren't people's mortgages and payrolls and futures. I used to think if I just did enough, quietly enough, for long enough, something in the room would shift, that they'd notice, that the ledger would balance out on its own eventually, the way ledgers are supposed to. It never did. If anything, doing more just lowered the bar further. Helping with the taxes wasn't remarkable. It was expected, the way you expect a light switch to turn on the light. Covering the utilities wasn't generous. It was just what I did, the way water finds the low ground. I had become furniture in my own family, useful, load-bearing even, and entirely invisible. The dinner where I told them wasn't supposed to be a confrontation. Mark and I had debated for 2 weeks how and when to tell them, whether to do it privately first or all together, whether 12 weeks was too early or exactly right. In the end, we decided together, at a Sunday dinner, the same table where every other announcement in our family's history had happened. I brought the sonogram in an envelope in my purse like it was something fragile, which I suppose it was. Dinner went the way it always went. My mother talked about her garden. My father talked about a plumbing issue at the house that I already knew he wasn't going to mention needed money, because I would quietly handle it the way I quietly handled everything. Vanessa talked at length about the property she was closing on, a 4-bedroom in a development with a name like a resort, and about the tenants she planned to install within the month, and about how proud she was of herself for building something from nothing. She had not built it from nothing. I had built the floor she was standing on, but I said nothing, because saying something had never once worked before, and some old, tired part of me still believed that this time, if I timed it right, if I smiled enough first, something might actually go differently. When dessert came out, I took a breath, reached into my purse, and set the little black and white photo on the table next to the pie. Mark and I are having a baby, I said. The silence that followed wasn't a happy one. It had a texture to it, thick and wrong, like a held breath in a room that had forgotten how to exhale. My mother picked up the photo by its corner, the way you'd pick up something you weren't sure was clean, and let out a short, sharp laugh. Your sister just closed on her new house today, she said, setting the photo back down like it weighed nothing. That's the only good news in this family. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and smirked at the ceiling before he looked at me. Great, he said. Now we have 2 burdens. I looked at Vanessa, some old reflex still hoping she'd say something, anything, in my defense. She was looking at her phone. For 33 years, I had been quietly, desperately seeking their approval, and sitting there, listening to them describe my unborn child as a liability before it had even been born. Something inside me that had been slowly fraying for a very long time finally, cleanly, snapped. I stood up. I didn't say a word. I picked up my coat and I walked out of that house. The following 2 weeks were the quietest my phone had ever been. No apology arrived. No one asked how I was feeling, whether the nausea had eased, whether we picked names, whether there was anything they could do to help now that there was, undeniably, a grandchild on the way. It was as if the pregnancy had simply been filed away with the rest of the things about me that didn't fit the family's preferred narrative. Mark noticed the change in me before I let myself notice it. He'd catch me sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open to our bank account, scrolling slowly through 6 years of automatic transfers, my jaw tight, my eyes somewhere far away. You don't have to do anything yet, he told me one night, his hand warm on my shoulder. You don't have to decide anything right now. I know, I said, but some part of me had already decided. It had decided the moment my father called our child a burden, and every day of silence afterward only sharpened the decision into something with edges. He'd asked me before, gently, over the years, why I never told my parents no. I never had a good answer beyond some version of maybe maybe this time it'll be different. An answer that had stopped satisfying even me a long time ago. I think some part of me had always known that the day I finally said no to them, everything I had quietly built between us, however unequal, however one-sided, would come apart completely. I had just never expected that day to be the same day I told them I was pregnant. Then, on a Tuesday morning, 13 days after that dinner, my mother's name lit up my phone screen. For one brief, foolish second, some small girl inside me hoped this was the call where she said she was sorry. "Waverly," she said, skipping any hello at all. "Vanessa's housewarming is in 3 weeks. I need you to book the caterers we used for her promotion party and handle the deposit today. She's completely swamped with the closing paperwork." I sat at my desk for a moment, genuinely stunned by the sheer, uncomplicated audacity of it. "Mom, I'm not organizing or paying for Vanessa's party," I said, keeping my voice level. "And like I told you 2 weeks ago, Mark and I are focused on our own family right now." She scoffed, a sound I had heard my entire life and had somehow never gotten used to. "Don't start with that drama again, Waverly. You're being completely selfish and bitter over a little joke your father made. Your sister is doing big things, and the least you could do is support her instead of trying to ruin everything, like you always do." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. "If you're going to be bitter and refuse to help your sister with her big day, don't expect to be included in the family legacy. You need to know your place." I read it twice. Then I felt something settle in me, cold and completely clear, the way a lake settles after a stone finally hits the bottom. "Message received, Dad," I said out loud to the empty kitchen. "You'll get your answer very soon." To understand why I'd let it go on for 6 years, why I hadn't simply said no the first time my mother asked me to quietly fix something that was never mine to fix, you have to go back further than the sonogram, further than the loan, further even than the property taxes. You have to go back to when I was 19 and Vanessa was 22. And I made a mistake that could have ended my life as I knew it before it had properly started. I don't tell this part often. I'm not telling all of it even now, but it matters because it's the hinge everything else swung on. And if I leave it out, the rest of this doesn't make sense. And I need it to make sense, if only to myself. I was a sophomore in college, home for winter break, and I did something reckless and stupid involving a car that wasn't mine to drive and a road I shouldn't have been on at that hour and in that condition. Nobody was hurt. I want to say that clearly first because it matters. Nobody was hurt, but there was damage, real damage, to someone else's property. And there were witnesses, and there was a real possibility for about 48 hours that my life would take a very different shape than the one it eventually took. My father, at the time, was up for a position at his company that hinged partly on nothing embarrassing touching the family name. My mother had strong, specific ideas about what kind of daughter she had raised, and I did not fit them even on a good day, let alone this one. Vanessa found out before either of them did. I called her shaking at 2 in the morning because she was the only person I could think to call who might actually help instead of immediately telling our parents. And she did help. She drove out, she made calls I didn't understand at the time and still only half understand now. She leaned on a family friend who worked in exactly the right office, and within 2 days, the entire situation had been handled so quietly that my parents never learned a single detail of it. To this day, I don't think they know it happened at all. Vanessa never asked me for anything in return. Not explicitly. Not once, in 6 years, did she say the words "you owe me." She didn't have to. I carried it myself, the way you carry something you've decided you're responsible for whether or not anyone ever hands you the bill. So when she needed a cosigner 3 years later for her first loan, and her credit wasn't where it needed to be because she'd overextended herself buying the appearance of success before she built the substance of it, I didn't hesitate. I told myself it was because I loved my sister. That was true. But underneath it, quieter, was the other truth. I thought I was still paying her back for the version of me that never had to exist in my parents' eyes. The reckless one. The one who almost broke everything. I never resented her for it. Not exactly. Not in a way I let myself look at directly. But I think it's part of why I never said no to my parents either. Not really. Not all the way. Some part of me had decided a long time ago that I owed this family a debt for the mercy of not knowing who I really was underneath the quiet, reliable version of me they'd settled on. I paid that debt in property taxes and utility transfers and co-signed loans year after year, and I told myself it was generosity, when really, for a long time, it was fear wearing generosity's clothes. I met Mark the spring after I graduated at a mutual friend's barbecue, and I remember with total clarity the first time I told him about my family, sitting on his back porch with 2 beers between us and the sun going down orange over the fence line. I told him the sanitized version, the one where my parents were simply old-fashioned and favored Vanessa a little, and he listened and nodded and didn't push. It took almost 2 years before I told him the fuller version, the one with actual numbers in it, the actual dollar amounts I'd quietly funneled toward keeping my family's world from cracking. He didn't get angry, not at first. He got quiet, in the specific way he gets quiet when he's turning something over carefully before he speaks. Then he asked me one question that I have thought about more times than I can count in the years since. "What happens," he said, "the day you stop?" I didn't have an answer then. I don't think I let myself imagine it, because imagining it meant imagining the house without me holding it up, and some part of me was afraid of what that version of the story looked like. Afraid they'd fall. Afraid, if I'm honest, that some small, ugly part of me wanted them to. We got married 2 years after that conversation, in a small ceremony that my parents attended and mostly tolerated, my mother spending more time discussing an upcoming trip with a cousin than she spent looking at me in my dress. Vanessa gave a toast. It was a good toast, actually. Warm and a little funny. And for one evening, I let myself believe that maybe things between us, real things, could still grow underneath underneath the tangled financial roots I planted without quite meaning to. They didn't grow. If anything, the roots just got thicker, more tangled, harder to see the shape of anything else underneath them. There was a particular year, the 3rd year of our marriage, that I think about often now. My father's hours had been cut at the plant that winter, and instead of telling me directly, he mentioned it once, sideways, at a dinner, the way you'd mention whether you expected someone else to plan around. I didn't wait to be asked. I quietly increased the transfer amount that month and the month after until it became the new baseline, the new normal, without a single conversation ever happening about it out loud. Nobody thanked me. Nobody, as far as I could tell, ever fully registered that anything had changed at all, which was, in its own quiet way, the most efficient kind of erasure I have ever witnessed. I had become so seamlessly load-bearing that the structure no longer registered me as separate from itself. Mark watched all of this happen in real time, and to his credit, he mostly held his tongue, trusting that I would find my own way to the edge of my patience eventually, rather than being pushed there by him. He wasn't wrong to trust that. He was only wrong about how long it would take. When I found out I was pregnant 12 weeks before that Sunday dinner, the first person I told after Mark was not my mother. It was Vanessa. I don't fully know why. Old habit, maybe. Some leftover loyalty to the person who'd once driven out at 2 in the morning without asking a single question first. She was happy for me, or said she was. In the particular clipped way she said most things that weren't directly about her own life. "That's great, Wav," she'd said over the phone, already half distracted by something on her end of the line. "We should celebrate. Once things calm down on my end, this closing has been an absolute nightmare." I remember hanging up and feeling something small and stupid deflate in my chest. I had wanted, I think, for her to ask more questions, to want to know how I was feeling, what the doctor had said, whether I was scared. She didn't ask. She never really did, about anything that wasn't hers. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things over the years that turned out not to be true. That Saturday, my parents called what they termed a family meeting, though the word meeting implies some possibility of discussion, and this was never going to be that. When Mark and I arrived, the atmosphere in the house was already thick with a kind of condescension I could have drawn a diagram of. Vanessa sat at the head of the dining table, in the chair my father usually sat in, flanked by both of my parents like she was presiding over something formal. My mother had put out the good coffee cups, the ones she saved for company, which struck me even then as a strange choice for a meeting meant to correct me. "We invited you here so you can apologize to your sister and start acting like a daughter," my mother said before I'd even taken my coat off. Vanessa didn't look up from her phone right away. When she finally did, she gave me a look that managed to be both pitying and bored. "Look, Waverly, I get that it's hard watching me close on my second investment property while you're just starting a family you probably can't afford, but you need to stop being jealous. It's embarrassing, honestly, for both of us." "Another mouth to feed on a glorified bookkeeper's salary," my father added, with the small, satisfied laugh of a man who thought he was being clever. "You should be learning from your sister, not fighting her." I sat down. I didn't argue with any of it. Not the bookkeeper comment, not the accusation of jealousy. None of it. I had stopped somewhere in the last 2 weeks, expecting this room to ever hear me the way I needed to be heard. Instead, I reached into my bag and set a black leather binder on the table and opened it. "Vanessa," I said, "congratulations on the new property." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "However, as the primary guarantor and financial backer on the joint agreement you used for collateral, I filed a formal revocation this morning due to non-disclosure of liabilities on the original loan application. The bank was notified as of 9 a.m. Without my credit profile and my personal guarantee behind it, your closing has been frozen." The room went very still. "What?" Vanessa's voice had lost all of its earlier boredom. "You can't do that." "I can," I said, and I did. I turned to my parents, whose faces had both gone through several stages of confusion in the span of about 4 seconds. "And Mom, Dad, since apparently we're a burden, I've also filed to remove myself from the primary residence designation on your property deed. That means the property tax relief you've had for 6 years, the relief tied specifically to my name being on that filing, ends as of today. The automatic transfers I've been sending for your utilities and your insurance premiums have also been canceled, effective this morning." Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. My father's mouth was open, and nothing was coming out of it. My mother was staring down at the paperwork I'd slid across the table like she expected it to rearrange itself into something less true if she looked hard enough. Then, all at once, the room broke open. "You can't do this to us." My mother's voice cracked down the middle, the pitch climbing until it barely sounded like her at all. "We're your parents. You are destroying your own family, Waverly. Do you understand that?" My father was on his feet now, all the earlier smugness drained out of his face and replaced with something closer to real fear. Without the subsidies, without the tax relief, his fixed retirement income wouldn't cover the interest on the house's expenses, and we both knew it, and neither of us said it out loud. "Waverly, stop this. We were joking. You know how we are. We've always been like this. It doesn't mean anything." Vanessa was staring at her phone, her face gone the color of the tablecloth, an email notification glowing on the screen. "If the bank pulls out now, I lose my entire deposit, my reputation. Waverly, please, just sign the papers back. I'll do anything." It was strange, almost anthropologically strange, how quickly their contempt curdled into begging the moment they understood I was actually holding weight they had never once acknowledged I was carrying. I looked at the three of them, my whole family arranged around that table in various stages of panic, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not satisfaction exactly. Something closer to relief, the specific relief of setting down a bag you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten your shoulder could feel any other way. "I'm not signing anything back," I said. "I came here because you asked me to, and I told you I'd give you an answer. This is the answer." father. I stood up. Mark stood with me, quiet the entire time, his hand finding the small of my back the way it always did when he could tell I needed the reminder that I wasn't standing there alone. Waverly. My mother's voice had shifted again, softer now, pleading in a register I had genuinely never heard from her before. Please, we can talk about this. We can fix this. I hope you do fix it, I said, and I meant it in a strange, exhausted way. But you're going to have to fix it without me. We walked out. Behind us, I could hear my mother's voice rising again, and my father's low, urgent murmuring, and underneath both of them, very quietly, my sister crying in a way I don't think I had heard since we were children. In the weeks that followed, the fallout arrived in pieces, the way news about people you're no longer speaking to always seems to. My aunt called Mark, not me, to say that Vanessa had lost the deposit on the property after all, the closing having genuinely fallen through once the bank reviewed the discrepancy in the original application. A cousin mentioned, at a wedding I heard about secondhand, that my parents were looking into refinancing the house, that my father had gone in to speak to someone at the bank about the mortgage terms for the first time since I could remember him needing to. I want to tell you that I felt vindicated hearing all of this. Mostly I felt tired, the particular tiredness of a person who has just set down something heavy and discovered that her arms still ache long after the weight is gone because the muscles have forgotten how to hold anything else. Mark and I threw ourselves into preparing for the baby instead. We painted the small back room a warm, pale yellow, gender-neutral, hopeful. I went to my appointments without dreading the moment my mother would ask, pointedly, whether I was sure I could handle all this on top of everything else. A question she had never once finished, because there was no on top of everything else. There had only ever been this. There had only ever been them. And now, finally, there wasn't. For a while, I thought that was the whole story. The confrontation, the fallout, the quiet, hard-won piece of a house with no one in it demanding anything of me. I thought I had found the bottom of it, the true shape of what 6 years of silent obligation had cost me and what walking away had finally given back. I was wrong. There was a floor underneath that floor, and I found it almost by accident 4 months later, going through a box of old paperwork I should have shredded years earlier. I was 7 months pregnant by then, and nesting in the particular, slightly manic way that seems to overtake you in the final stretch, when suddenly every closet in the house needs to be confronted at once. I had pulled an old cardboard box out from the back of our hall closet, one I'd carried through 2 apartments and 1 house move without ever opening it, labeled in my own handwriting from years earlier. Old files. Shred. Most of it was exactly what the label promised. Old bank statements, a lease from an apartment I'd shared with a college roommate whose face I could barely picture anymore, a stack of pay stubs from a job I'd had for 11 months before the auditing position came through. Near the bottom, in a manila envelope I didn't remember putting there, I found a folded letter in Vanessa's handwriting, dated the winter I was 19. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where I have to decide how much of it is mine to tell, and how much of it belongs to my sister, whatever is left of our relationship now that I've told this much. I'll tell it as fairly as I can. The letter wasn't addressed to me. It was a draft, unsent, of something Vanessa had apparently written to our parents back when I was 19 and had done the reckless, frightening thing I mentioned before, the thing she'd quietly cleaned up on my behalf in the middle of the night without asking me a single question first. In the letter, she wasn't confessing anything about me. She was confessing something about herself, something I had never known, something that reframed 6 years of my life in about the time it took to read 4 paragraphs. Vanessa had been the one driving that night, not me. I sat on the closet floor for a long time after I read it, the letter shaking slightly in my hands, my heart doing something complicated and hard to name. The story I had believed for 14 years, the story I had built an entire architecture of guilt and quiet repayment on top of, was not quite the story that had actually happened. I had been in the car. I had, in a real sense, been part of what happened that night, but I had not been the one behind the wheel. Vanessa had been driving, past the point where she should have been driving anything, and when the damage was done, in the panic and the dark and the fear of what our father's reputation and our mother's careful narrative could survive, we had agreed, in the space of about 10 frantic minutes, that I would say it had been me. I don't fully remember agreeing to it, if I'm honest. I remember being terrified, and I remember Vanessa's voice, steady in a way mine wasn't, telling me it would be easier this way, that nobody would look twice at me getting into some minor trouble, that my life had more room in it to absorb a mistake than hers did, with her position, her reputation, the internship she was 3 months into that could not survive even a whisper of a DUI attached to her name. I believed her. I was 19 and frightened, and it was easier to believe her than to sit with what had actually happened. And somewhere in the years since, the story had calcified in my memory until I genuinely, completely believed it had been me all along. I had spent 6 years quietly repaying a debt for a mistake that was never mine to begin with. The letter, the unsent one, was Vanessa's attempt, at some point I couldn't date exactly, maybe a year or 2 after it happened, to finally tell our parents the truth, to take back what she'd let me carry. She had written it, and then, judging by the fact that it was in my box and not anywhere near our parents' hands, she had never sent it. She had folded it up and put it somewhere, and let me go on carrying something that had never been mine. I didn't know then how the letter had ended up in my box instead of hers. I still don't know for certain. My best guess, the one I've made an uneasy peace with, is that at some point, years ago, in the middle of one of the many small favors and co-signed documents and folders we passed back and forth over the years, it got mixed in among my own paperwork by accident, and neither of us ever noticed until now. I sat on that closet floor with my hand resting on the curve of my stomach, feeling my daughter shift beneath my palm, and I thought about every property tax payment, every automatic transfer, every loan I had quietly co-signed signed without a second thought. All of it built on top of a version of events that had never actually happened the way I believed it had. I thought about calling Vanessa immediately. I didn't. I sat there instead for a long time, letting the shape of the last 6 years rearrange itself around this new, unwelcome piece of information. And I found, underneath the shock, something that surprised me more than the letter itself. I wasn't only angry at her for letting me carry it. I was angry at myself too for how easily I had accepted the burden in the first place. How readily I had built an entire identity around being the one who fixes things, the one who quietly absorbs whatever needs absorbing, long before Vanessa's unsent letter ever gave that identity its first false foundation. Mark found me still sitting on the closet floor 20 minutes later, the letter in my lap, the box half emptied around me. "Hey," he said carefully, crouching down. "What is it?" I handed him the letter without a word. I watched his face change as he read it, watched the exact moment he understood what it meant, the same moment I had understood it 20 minutes earlier. "Waverly." His voice was very quiet. "This changes everything you told yourself about the last 6 years." "I know," I said. "Are you going to call her?" I looked down at the letter again, at Vanessa's handwriting from a version of herself 14 years younger, scared enough to write the truth down and brave enough to almost send it, and not quite brave enough to actually let it go. "Not yet," I said. "I need to sit with it first." I sat with it for 6 days. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters, that this wasn't some immediate, dramatic phone call the moment I found the letter. Grief and clarity don't usually work that fast. I went to 2 more prenatal appointments. I finished painting the trim in the nursery. I lay awake next to Mark at night, running the same 4 paragraphs through my head on a loop, watching the story of my own life quietly reassemble itself into something I barely recognized. By the 6th day, I knew what I needed to do, and it wasn't what I would have guessed, sitting on that closet floor in the first raw hour of finding the letter. I called Vanessa on a Thursday afternoon. While Mark was at work and the house was quiet except for the low hum of the baby monitor we'd started testing even though there was no baby in it yet, just habit, just practice for a life that hadn't started. She picked up on the 4th ring, her voice carrying that same clipped, distracted energy it always had, like she was doing 3 other things while she talked to me. "Hey, Wav, everything okay?" "I found the letter," I said. There was a silence on the line long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "What letter?" she said finally, and her voice had gone very flat. "The one you wrote to Mom and Dad, the one you never sent. I found it in an old box, from when I was 19. Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had lost the clipped distraction entirely. It sounded, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like she was actually present in the conversation. "I've thought about that letter for 14 years, she said quietly. "I wrote about 6 drafts of it. That was the last one. I never had the nerve to send any of them." "Why not?" I asked, and I meant it as a real question, not an accusation, though I could hear how it might have landed as one. "Because by the time I wrote it, you'd already absorbed it," she said. "You'd already told them it was you. You'd already built your whole life around being the responsible one who made one mistake and spent the rest of her life making up for it." I told myself sending the letter wouldn't undo the damage. It would just add a second disaster on top of the first one. I told myself I was protecting you by staying quiet. "You weren't protecting me, Vanessa," I said. "You were protecting yourself. And then you let me spend 6 years quietly paying for something that was never mine to pay for." I heard her breath catch on the other end of the line. "I know," she said. "I've known that for a long time. I just didn't know how to undo it without unraveling everything, including whatever was left of us actually being sisters." "You didn't have to undo it," I said. "You just had to tell me the truth at any point in 14 years. Would you have believed me?" she asked, something raw in her voice now. "You'd already rebuilt the whole story in your head. I think some part of me was afraid that telling you the truth would just take away the only version of events that let the debt feel like it meant something." "That's not your decision to make for me," I said. "You don't get to decide what version of my own life I'm allowed to know." "You're right," she said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I've forgiven myself honestly in 14 years. I just wanted you to know the guilt was never only yours. I carried mine by staying silent. You carried yours by writing checks." We didn't resolve anything on that call. There was no clean forgiveness, no tidy reconciliation, but there was, underneath all of it, an actual conversation between 2 actual people. Maybe the first one we'd had in years. "I need time," I told her. "I need to figure out what I actually believe. Now that I know the story I've been telling myself for 14 years wasn't the real one." "That's fair," she said. "Take whatever time you need. I'm not asking you to fix this fast." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet nursery for a long time, my hand on my stomach, feeling the specific grounding weight of a life that hadn't happened yet, a life that had no debt attached to it at all, no inherited guilt, no quiet arrangement made in a panicked 10 minutes when I was 19 years old. I thought about calling my parents, telling them everything, unraveling the whole 14-year architecture in one conversation. I decided against it, not out of loyalty to Vanessa exactly, though there was some of that, mostly because I understood sitting there that the truth of who was driving that night had never actually been the real debt I'd been paying all these years. The real debt was the one I'd built for myself, out of a need to be useful in a family that had never once, in 33 years, made me feel like I mattered without it. Vanessa's letter hadn't created that need. It had only given it a story to attach itself to. Even if she'd sent it 14 years ago, even if I'd known the whole truth from the start, I think some version of me still would have found a way to become the family's quiet financial backbone, because somewhere very early on, long before that night in the car, I had learned that being needed was the closest thing to being loved that this particular family had on offer. I sat with that thought for a long time in the quiet nursery, letting it settle into something I could actually carry forward instead of just something that had knocked me sideways for an afternoon. I didn't call my parents parents that day. I called them a week later, calmly, and told them I loved them, and that I hoped they found their way back to some version of stability, and that I would not be the one rebuilding it for them this time. My mother cried. My father, for once, didn't say anything clever or dismissive. He just said, quietly, "I don't think we ever really saw you, Waverly. I'm sorry for that," which was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from him in 33 years, and it landed somewhere real, even if it didn't undo anything. My daughter was born on a Tuesday in early spring, 6 weeks after that phone call with my mother, into a room with no cameras from relatives waiting outside it, no group text updating everyone at once, nothing performative about it at all, just Mark and me, and a nurse who kept telling me I was doing beautifully. And then, all at once, the specific, overwhelming quiet of a person who has just arrived in the world and doesn't yet know a single thing about what she's inherited or hasn't. I named her Clara, after no one in particular, which felt important. I didn't want her first name to carry anyone else's debt. Vanessa came to the hospital 2 days later, alone, without our parents, carrying a small, carefully wrapped gift and an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something like nervousness, something like a person walking into a room uncertain of her welcome. "You don't have to let me hold her," she said, standing in the doorway. "I just wanted to see you both. And to say I'm sorry, not the kind of sorry I can undo with an apology, just the kind where I need you to know I mean it." She stood there for a moment, not quite crossing the threshold, and I realized she was waiting for permission in a way I don't think I'd ever seen her wait for anything before. Vanessa had spent her whole life walking into rooms like she owned them. Watching her hesitate in a hospital doorway, holding a gift bag with both hands like it might steady her, told me something had genuinely shifted in her too, not just in me. "Come in," I said. "You don't have to stand out there." She sat in the chair beside the bed, careful and quiet, and for a while neither of us said much of anything. Mark had stepped out to get coffee, giving us the room, though I don't think either of us had asked him to. Clara stirred against my chest, made a small, unbothered sound, and settled again. "She's got Dad's chin," Vanessa said eventually, leaning in slightly to look. "God help her." I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in what felt like days. It surprised both of us, I think, how easy that small moment was, how it slid in sideways past everything heavier sitting between us. "I keep thinking about what you said on the phone," I told her, "about not knowing how to undo it without unraveling everything. I don't think you get to undo it. I don't think that's how any of this works, but I don't want us to spend the next 30 years performing a version of sisters either. I'd rather have whatever this actually is." "I don't know what this actually is yet," she admitted. "I'm still figuring that out myself." "That's fair," I said. "Take your time. I'm not in a hurry anymore. I think that's the one thing that's actually changed." I looked at her for a long moment, my daughter asleep against my chest, and I thought about 14 years of an unsent letter and 6 years of quiet checks, and one phone call that had finally cracked the whole story open into something closer to true. "You can hold her," I said. "It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet. I don't know if it ever will be, completely. Some debts, once you understand their real shape, don't resolve into anything as clean as forgiveness. They just become something you carry differently, with your eyes open this time instead of blind." But I watched my sister hold my daughter for the first time, careful and quiet in a way I had rarely seen her be about anything, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, some old tired knot I had been carrying since I was 19 years old and let someone else's mistake quietly become the architecture of my entire life. My parents sent a card, not a visit, not yet, just a card, in my mother's handwriting that said congratulations, and beneath it, in my father's smaller print, added almost as an afterthought, "I hope she knows from the very beginning that she was never a burden to anyone." I read that line more times than I probably needed to. I don't know if he understood, writing it, that he was apologizing for more than just the one comment at that dinner table. I don't know if he understood everything underneath it, the 14 years, the letter, the quiet debt I'd spent most of my adult life repaying without ever knowing what it was actually for. I've decided it doesn't matter whether he understood the full shape of it. What matters is that my daughter will grow up in a house where nobody hands her a debt she didn't ask for and calls it love, where being needed and being wanted are not, as I once believed, the exact same thing wearing two different names. That was the actual floor underneath the floor, not who had been driving that night 14 years ago, not the letter I found by accident in a box marked for shredding, the plain, hard-won fact that I had spent 33 years mistaking usefulness for belonging, and it took a stranger's cruelty toward my own unborn child and my sister's shaking voice on the other end of a phone line to finally show me the difference between the two. I still don't know exactly what my relationship with my parents will look like 5 years from now or 10. I don't know what it will look like with Vanessa either, whether the quiet, careful thing rebuilding between us will hold or eventually give way again to old patterns neither of us has fully unlearned. I know only this: my daughter will never once wonder whether she's a burden. I will make sure of that, the same quiet, determined way I once made sure the lights stayed on in a house that never once said thank you. Some debts you pay because you owe them. Some debts you pay because somewhere along the way you convinced yourself you did. I spent 6 years unable to tell the difference. It took a phone call, a letter, and my daughter's first breath to finally show me which one had been true all along.